I feel kind of bad for supraspinatus. It doesn't get any glory.
What's up, anatomy nerds? Welcome to Anatomy Bites, a show for physical therapy students and beyond, where we discuss different parts of the body in bite-sized little chunks. This podcast is for anyone interested in learning anatomy for medical professionals, including PTs, MDs, pre-health students, and more. Thank you for joining us. Let's get on with today's show. And remember, this show is for educational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice. Psst. Hey you, nerd. Yeah, you. Before we get started, can I ask you a favor? Has Anatomy Bites helped deepen your understanding of the human body? Or helped you study for that lab practical that you were really struggling with? If so, would you mind helping us boost our rankings in your favorite podcast app? If you're feeling the love for Anatomy Bites and you want to share those good vibrations, can you please rate and subscribe to this show? It's super simple and it will help us a long way. If you're listening to this podcast on the Apple Podcast app, rating and leaving a comment is super quick and easy. All you need to do is scroll down from the main show page until you see ratings and reviews and tap those 5 little stars and leave a comment if you feel so inclined. If you're on Spotify from the main show page, just hit those 3 little dots in the upper right-hand corner of your screen and select Rate Show from there. It's super easy, and doing this small kindness will help boost our rankings and help others find out about the show. So if you're feeling the love, hook us up. Thanks, and let's get on with it.
Hello, welcome back to Anatomy Bites. Today we are talking about the topic of shoulder abduction and the muscles that help to power that, specifically the deltoid and the supraspinatus. Now, I feel like the deltoids are overrepresented in discussion. We'll talk more about that later. And little old supraspinatus doesn't get a whole lot of attention. So I felt like I had to do them both together because, let's face it, they help each other out. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into that anatomy bite right off the bat. We'll talk about why it's important after the fact.
The deltoid muscle. The deltoid muscle is a large, thick, triangular muscle which covers the shoulder joint in front, behind, and laterally. It arises from the anterior border and upper surface of the lateral third of the clavicle, from the lateral margin and upper surface of the acromion, and from the lower lip of the posterior border of the spine of the scapula, as far back as the triangular surface at its medial end. From this extensive origin, the fibers converge toward their insertion. The middle passes vertically, the anterior obliquely backward and laterally, and the posterior obliquely forward and laterally. They unite in a thick tendon, which is inserted into the deltoid prominence on the middle of the lateral side of the body of the humerus. At its insertion, the muscle gives off an expansion to the deep fascia of the arm. This muscle is remarkably coarse in texture, and the arrangement of its fibers is somewhat peculiar. The central portion of the muscle, that is to say, the part arising from the acromion, consists of oblique fibers. These arise in a bipeniform manner from the sides of the tendinous intersections, generally 4 in number, which are attached above to the acromion and pass downward parallel to one another in the substance of the muscle. The oblique fibers thus formed are inserted into similar tendinous intersections, generally 3 in number, which pass upward from the insertion of the muscle and alternate with the descending septa. The portions of the muscle arising from the clavicle and spine of the scapula are not arranged in this manner, but are inserted into the margins of the inferior tendon. Nerve supply. The deltoid muscle is supplied by the 5th and 6th cervical nerve root through the axillary nerve, C5-C6. Actions. The deltoid muscle raises the arm from the side so as to bring it at right angles with the trunk. Its anterior fibers, assisted by the pectoralis major, draw the arm forward into shoulder flexion and medially into internal shoulder rotation. Its posterior fibers, aided by the teres major and latissimus dorsi, draw it backward into shoulder extension. The posterior fibers also aid the teres minor and infraspinatus muscles in external shoulder rotation. The middle fibers, assisted by the supraspinatus muscle, draw it laterally away from the body into shoulder abduction. Supraspinatus. Attachments. The supraspinatus muscle occupies the supraspinous fossa of the scapula, arising from its medial 2/3 and from the strong supraspinous fascia. The muscular fibers converge to a tendon, which crosses through the subacromial space to the upper part of the shoulder joint and is inserted into the most superior of the 3 impressions on the greater tubercle of the humerus. The tendon is intimately adhered to the capsule of the shoulder joint. Nerve supply. The supraspinatus muscle is supplied by the 5th and 6th cervical nerve roots through the suprascapular nerve, C5-C6. Actions. The supraspinatus muscle assists the deltoid muscle in raising the arm from the side of the trunk into shoulder abduction. As part of the rotator cuff, it also fixes or stabilizes the head of the humerus in the glenoid cavity during movement of the shoulder.
So there you have it. There's the anatomy bite about the deltoid and the supraspinatus, that power couple that assist with shoulder abduction. Now, one thing I want to make sure that we are paying attention to is the role that the supraspinatus plays in shoulder abduction. Because let's face it, you're at the gym, you're doing lateral raises, and I bet you never even thought about your supraspinatus. Not one time, unless A, you were an anatomy student already, B, you tore your rotator cuff at some point, okay? So, and this is actually going to lead into a further discussion in a follow-up episode in greater detail of the rotator cuff, because you can't talk about supraspinatus without considering the rest of the pieces of that rotator cuff. And I will say that the deltoid is not part of the rotator cuff, okay? But going back to the topic of shoulder abduction, again, we have to talk about this power couple, deltoid and supraspinatus. So when you start the action of shoulder abduction, we have to understand that supraspinatus is actually the player that starts that action. So the first 15 degrees of shoulder abduction is powered by supraspinatus specifically. And then it will help the deltoid up to about 90 degrees of shoulder abduction, at which point the deltoid takes over and the supraspinatus simply doesn't have enough torque at that point. Supraspinatus is a teeny tiny little guy. So if you ever take a look in, on a shoulder model or a cadaver study or just an anatomy text, compared to the deltoid, supraspinatus is just a little flimsy guy. But it has a really huge responsibility. And so when we're talking about shoulders, shoulder injuries, the rotator cuff, we tend to see a lot of supraspinatus tears. Listen to that again. When we hear about rotator cuff injury, we see a lot of supraspinatus tears. So, it's important to keep in mind if you are doing a lot of shoulder training, right? Give your rotator cuff some love, okay? And, of course, this is not medical advice, but when you're doing shoulder training, don't forget about the rotator cuff. Most of them are really small anyways, and they have a huge responsibility. Our arms have a lot of torque involved. So give that supraspinatus a little bit of love because it needs it, okay? Also, one of my general philosophies is train for the life that you want. In fact, that was a great takeaway from one of my clinical rotations, one of our sort of substitute clinical instructors who, got to take care of me and my colleague every once in a while. basically, that's his philosophy, and he imparted that onto me. You have to train for the life that you want. So if you want to be able to lift heavy things, you have to be able to train your shoulders. When you train your shoulders, you have to think about your rotator cuff, supraspinatus, etc. Now, another thing to keep in mind is the angle at which that supraspinatus is going to operate the best. Now, this is not an angle that a lot of us know about, but it is called scaption. Okay, so scaption is essentially the position of which, or the degree of which, the arm is going to be horizontally adducted, which is slight, but it's not going to be in a plane, purely in that frontal plane. It's going to be a little bit forward, okay, so that the arm is aligned properly with the scapula. Okay, so that is called the scaption angle. And as you come up overhead, that is a good way to get that supraspinatus a little bit more directly. Okay, but again, train as you wish, but keep in mind the David and Goliath of this story is going to be little David, supraspinatus. Okay. One thing I do love about the deltoid, though, is that it does work in several different angles. So, if we're going to be performing shoulder flexion, it's involved. Shoulder abduction, it's involved. And also shoulder extension and even a bit of horizontal abduction as well. So depending on which part of the deltoid you are demanding operate, it's involved in all of those actions. So we do need to give the deltoid its credit, right? It's day in the sun here. But hopefully you learned something new about your supraspinatus, which maybe was a muscle that you hadn't even heard of before. Okay, so there we have it. That's the anatomy bite of the day. Stay tuned in the future. Next episode is going to deal with the rest of the rotator cuff. And that's the anatomy bite for today. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time. This show is written, produced, hosted, and recorded by Nikki-Rae Alkema, Doctor of Physical Therapy. Moral support and occasional snoring provided by the resident pit bulls, also known as the Itty Bitty Pity Committee, Vita and Zoe. Anatomy readings are sourced from the United States public domain text, Anatomy of the Human Body, 20th edition, by Henry Gray and Warren H. Lewis. Opinions and commentary are my own and do not represent any institution or professional affiliation. Lastly, this show is for educational purposes only and should not be construed as medical advice.